The little Band-Aid pusher won't last a week in a real high-pressure environment. That's what Terminal Manager Greg Hargrove said, loud enough for the entire TSA shift change to hear, loud enough for 3 travelers waiting at gate C7 to turn and stare. He'd made it a bet, $50 to anyone who'd take it, and his laughter carried across the Portland International Airport medical clinic like diesel exhaust. He had no idea who he was talking about. Ashley Cooper had run combat triage in Ramadi under enemy fire, had held teenagers' intestines together with her hands while mortars landed 60 meters away, had walked away from all of it 3 months ago because the PTSD had become a living thing inside her chest that woke her screaming at 2:19 a.m. Nobody at this airport knew that. Nobody knew anything except that she showed up on time, that she wore scrubs that never wrinkled, that she kept inventory logs so precise they bordered on obsessive. That was the point. She had chosen invisibility like a weapon. She had chosen this quiet clinic job specifically to disappear, to heal, to become the kind of person who could work 8-hour shifts without her hands trembling when a door slammed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their familiar white hum, and the smell of antiseptic hung in the stale air like a promise she kept making to herself: you can do this. You can be normal. You can stay hidden. But Hargrove wasn't finished. Not even close. Ashley had been 3 months into the job when she noticed the discrepancies. Small ones at first, a bottle of saline here, a bandage roll there, but in Ramadi she had learned that small mistakes killed people. That small oversights, compounded over weeks, became catastrophes. Her job was to maintain inventory in the clinic supply room, a task that should have been routine, administrative, the kind of work that let her mind rest while her hands stayed busy. She had organized the shelves by expiration date, by frequency of use, by a system so logical it would have made a logistics officer weep. Cold stainless steel shelving units lined 3 walls, and every item had its place. Every count reconciled to the decimal point. It was the only thing in her life right now that made sense. So when the epinephrine stock came up 17 units short over 6 weeks, not missing, not lost, but systematically vanishing in neat increments, she had documented it. Date, time, quantity, notation. She had documented it because that's what the protocol required. Because that's what kept people alive. She had documented it because some habits, once formed in blood and crisis, never died. The radio on her belt crackled with a call for assistance at gate A12, and she responded automatically, her hand already moving toward the crash cart. Her hands were steady. Scarred across the knuckles from an old shrapnel wound in Kandahar, marked with the pale lines of burns from a field hospital fire in Helmand province, but steady. Always steady. That's what they taught you in SEAL Team 7, your hands were the last thing between someone and death. Your hands had to remember the work even when your mind was dissolving. Her hands remembered everything. She grabbed the oxygen tanks, checked the flow rate, moved toward the gate with the kind of efficiency that made the other clinic staff, 2 paramedics who'd been here 8 years combined, step aside without being asked. She didn't tell them what to do. She didn't have to. They could feel it. Some people had presence, had authority baked into their DNA. Ashley had something different. She had the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. She had the kind of composure that made scared people believe they were going to be okay. The call was a false alarm, elderly passenger with indigestion, panic attack triggered by the crowd, and she was back in the clinic supply room by 8:34 a.m., checking the evening shift inventory against her meticulously maintained logs, when Hargrove appeared in the doorway. "My office," he said. No hello. No context. Just 2 words that made the entire room shift in some way she couldn't name. She followed him down the pale corridor, past the supply closets and the staff bathroom, to the small office that smelled like coffee and something else, something synthetic, pharmaceutical, like pills dissolved in water. Hargrove sat behind a desk that was messier than his demeanor, papers scattered in what appeared to be deliberate chaos. He gestured at a chair. She remained standing. "The epinephrine," he said, watching her with eyes that had already calculated something she hadn't learned yet. "You've been asking questions." "Inventory reconciliation requires documentation," Ashley said. Her voice came out flat, neutral, the way she'd learned to speak in hospitals where emotion was a luxury people couldn't afford. 17 units over 6 weeks. I wanted to ensure there wasn't a logging error on my end before escalating. There's no error, Hargrove said. He stood up. His presence had weight in the way that certain men's presence had weight, not because he was large, but because he'd spent years believing he was important. And you're not escalating anything. You're going to mark those units as dispensed and we're going to move on with our lives. Ashley's hands remained at her sides. She didn't clench them. She didn't pull them into fists. She let them hang there, loose and empty, the way a sniper's hands hung before the shot. The documentation would need to reflect who dispensed them and when. There's no medical record associated with. I don't care, Hargrove said, and his voice had changed now, had taken on the edge of someone who'd just realized that his private calculations had been interrupted. I don't care about your perfect inventory. I don't care about your obsessive little logs. You're new here. You don't understand how things work. Sacred Heart has been running fine for a decade without your paranoia. The epinephrine is missing, Ashley said. No, Hargrove said. It's not missing. It's been logged. It's been accounted for. And if you continue to be a problem about this, Ashley, we're going to have much bigger issues to discuss. She could have left then. She could have walked out of his office and transferred to a different clinic, or quit entirely, or made a phone call to someone who would have fixed this particular problem in under 4 hours. But that was the old life, the life that required her to use the contacts she'd spent 3 months burying. That was the life she'd left in Ramadi. So she turned and walked out of his office and went back to the supply room and didn't mention it again. Not yet. The next morning, everything changed. Hargrove called a shift briefing at 7:15 a.m., gathered the entire clinic staff, 6 people including Ashley, in the break room where the fluorescent panels buzzed their steady mechanical song and the coffee machine hissed with the sound of heating water. He stood against the counter like he'd been rehearsing for this moment, like he'd already decided how this would go. I want to take a moment to talk about workplace dynamics, he said, and Ashley already knew where this was headed, could see it the way she'd learned to see ambush patterns in convoy routes, could feel it in the air pressure change before the shot. I've noticed some of our newer staff members, he paused, looked directly at Ashley, held her gaze with the kind of intention that was meant to break people, have difficulty understanding that we're a team here. That accuracy isn't everything. That sometimes, you have to trust the people who've been here longer. One of the paramedics, a man named Derek, was already looking at the floor. So I've decided, Hargrove continued, that we're going to implement some changes. New inventory procedures. A double-check system. Just to make sure there's no confusion about how things actually work in the real world. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm guessing some people will find that kind of scrutiny a little overwhelming. We'll see who can handle it. The message was clear. The target was clear. Ashley stood there in her pressed scrubs with her steady hands and her hidden scars and her faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the patch she'd carried every single day since Ramadi, stitched where no one could see it, where she could feel it against her ribs like a heartbeat, and she said absolutely nothing. She had learned, in a place where words got people killed, that silence was a weapon sharper than anything you could say out loud. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, at 2:18 p.m., Hargrove arrived at the clinic with 2 TSA agents and a woman from the hospital's Human Resources Department. He gathered the staff again, this time in the main corridor, this time in front of patients and visitors who'd come to the clinic for band-aids and blood pressure checks and routine care. He held up a clipboard, her clipboard, the one with her inventory logs, and he read from it in a loud voice that echoed off the tile floor, exaggerating the precision of her documentation, making her meticulous care sound obsessive, paranoid, unprofessional. The TSA agents watched. The HR woman took notes. A teenage girl in the waiting area stared. These kinds of inconsistencies, Hargrove was saying, suggest a potential accuracy problem in her charting, which obviously raises questions about her fitness for clinical duties. Ashley's hands didn't tremble. Her face didn't flush. She simply watched him, the way you watched someone defuse a bomb, with complete focus, already calculating where the shrapnel would land. Then he did it. He took her clipboard, the one with 3 months of meticulous work, 3 months of documentation that had kept her tethered to something real, and he knocked it from her hands in one sharp motion. The papers scattered across the floor like damaged birds. Her coffee, which she'd been holding, which she'd brought from the break room 15 minutes ago, splashed across her scrubs, brown spreading across the white fabric like blood. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, loud enough that everyone could hear, loud enough that the entire clinic stopped moving. "Maybe accuracy isn't your strong suit." The room went dead silent. Ashley took one measured breath. She could feel the coffee seeping through the fabric, could feel it against her skin like a reminder, like a reset. She let herself feel it for exactly 1 second. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not because she was crying, but because a single tear had escaped without permission, and she looked directly at Hargrove with eyes that had stared down worse than this, that had seen worse than this, that carried the weight of a decade spent watching people die. "The discrepancy is 17 units over 6 weeks, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice coming out like still water, like something that had to be absolutely still or it would drown you. "Would you like me to document that observation formally?" The TSA agents exchanged a glance. The HR woman's pen stopped moving. Derek looked up from the floor. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, and Ashley bent down and gathered her scattered papers with steady hands while the clinic staff watched and the patients watched and the PA system crackled overhead with a call for assistance at gate C7 that would change everything. The silence stretched across the clinic for exactly 7 seconds. Then Hargrove's phone was already in his hand, his thumb moving with the precision of someone who'd made this call 100 times before. He didn't wait for the clinic to empty. He didn't even close his office door. He dialed the airport authority director's personal line, the one that wasn't supposed to be in circulation but somehow everyone with power had it anyway, and Ashley heard every word from where she knelt gathering her scattered papers. "Yeah, it's Greg. We've got a situation with one of the clinic contractors." His voice had changed. No longer the bully. Now something colder. Something administrative. The one I mentioned before. "She's becoming a liability. Erratic behavior, unauthorized procedures, endangering passengers." He paused, listening. "No, I don't have documentation yet, but I'm building the file. I wanted you to know this was coming before it hits official channels." Ashley's hands didn't shake as she stacked the papers. Her breathing remained level. She'd learned a long time ago that showing fear was like blood in the water, it accelerated everything that came next. A TSA agent pretended to check something on his clipboard. A clinic tech suddenly found intense interest in the hand sanitizer dispenser. No one wanted to be the one who'd witnessed this conversation. By 4:24 p.m. that same day, Hargrove had filed the first complaint with the Oregon Nursing Board. Not one complaint. 3. Each one meticulously crafted, each one plausible enough to survive initial review but false enough to sting. The first alleged that Ashley had administered medications without proper physician oversight. The second claimed she'd made dismissive comments about a patient's mental health concerns. The third, the one that made Ashley's throat tighten when she read the summary board email 3 days later, stated she'd performed an invasive medical procedure without authorization or appropriate training. He described the pericardiocentesis like she was some reckless novice who'd grabbed a needle because she felt like it. What Hargrove couldn't have known was that he was building a file against a woman who'd performed field surgery under mortar fire, who'd stabilized hemorrhaging soldiers in collapsed buildings while rounds punched through concrete, whose medical training had been more rigorous than anything the state of Oregon could legally require. But that detail wouldn't matter. The board didn't see medals. They saw allegations. And allegations were enough to freeze a license pending investigation. The phone call came on a Thursday morning at 6:13 a.m. Ashley was already awake, she rarely slept more than 4 hours anyway, when the detective from outside the clinic called. His name was Marcus Keene, and his voice carried the specific tiredness of a man who'd been doing favors for 20 years and was starting to regret every one. Hargrove had called in that DUI cover-up from 2019, apparently. Some incident with a board member's son, some late-night decision that had never made it to official records. Keene owed him. Now Keene was the investigator assigned to Ashley's case. "I'll need to conduct a formal interview," Keene said, and Ashley heard the apology underneath the words. "Statements from your colleagues. A full review of the incident in question." "Which incident?" Ashley's voice came out level, curious even. "The one where you performed cardiac intervention without a physician present." "There was a physician present. Dr. Hargrove says there wasn't." The silence on that line lasted 3 seconds. Ashley could hear the rain starting outside her apartment, the kind of rain that came to Portland in sheets, relentless and cold. She imagined Hargrove sitting in his office right now, already moving to the next phase. The investigator was just the beginning. By Monday, word had spread through Sacred Heart's Portland clinic like blood dispersing through saline. The agency nurses knew. The permanent staff knew. The other TSA medical contractors knew. Ashley had become radioactive, not quite fired, but everyone understood the writing was scrolling across the wall. The woman who'd been invisible 3 weeks ago, the one who kept to herself and maintained meticulous records, was now the subject of an investigation that hadn't even officially started. She came in Tuesday morning at 7:22 a.m. for what she thought was a standard shift. Instead, 2 security officers were waiting in the break room. One held a folder. One held a cardboard box. Neither of them looked comfortable. "We're going to need your badge," the older one said. His name tag read Thompson. He was maybe 60, with the specific sadness of someone who'd been firing people for 15 years and hated every minute. Ashley didn't argue. She unclipped the badge from her scrubs. The laminated photo of her showed someone who looked smaller than she actually was, someone who'd learned how to take up less space, and set it on the break room table. The plastic made a soft sound as it landed. "You're suspended pending the outcome of the investigation," Thompson continued, reading from the paperwork like he'd never read it before, like each word was a small pain. "You're not to enter clinic premises during business hours. Any attempt to do so will result in immediate prosecution for trespassing." "That's not," Ashley started. "I'm sorry," Thompson said, and she believed him. "It's not my call." But Hargrove was there. Of course he was. He stood in the hallway just outside the break room, watching through the small window in the door. When Ashley emerged with the cardboard box containing her personal items, a change of clothes, a photo of her son from 5 years ago, the unit patch she kept sewn in her jacket lining, Hargrove was waiting. "I told you," he said quietly, just loud enough for the gathering staff to hear. "Just a nurse. Sometimes that's all you are." He smiled. "And sometimes it's not even enough." Ashley carried the box past him without breaking stride. The TSA agents watched from their station. The clinic staff made themselves invisible. One of the newer nurses, Jennifer, maybe 25, fresh out of school, looked at Ashley with something that might have been pity or might have been fear. Probably both. The rain outside the terminal was coming down hard now, drumming against the glass doors, and Ashley stood there for a moment, just a moment, letting it blur everything beyond the exit. She could feel 36 eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of Hargrove's constructed narrative settling onto her shoulders like wet sand. But her hands didn't shake as she pushed through the doors into the Portland afternoon. She didn't know yet that this was rock bottom. That the next 3 days would fold her into shapes she didn't know she could still bend into. That walking through the doors of the VA hospital waiting room 72 hours from now would feel like stepping into a photograph of her own failure, sitting among the men and women she used to save, sitting there as a patient, broken in ways that had nothing to do with bullets. What happened next came at 3:38 a.m. on a Thursday, when Ashley's phone rang with a number she hadn't heard in 8 years, when her son's voice cracked saying, "Mom, they need to see these." But that wasn't the worst part. Gate C7 was 23 meters away. Ashley knew this because she counted it once on a slow shift, pacing the terminal corridor between flights, using the distance as a meditation, 1 foot forward, measure the space, master the geometry of a place that wasn't hers but was all she had. She was restocking the clinic supply cabinet when the sound cut through everything else, a man's breathing, thick and wet, like air being pulled through a closed fist. She didn't think. She moved. The body lay near the departure board, a man in army dress uniform, his lips the color of slate. His neck veins distended so severely they cast shadows. Ashley knelt beside him in one fluid motion, muscle memory, the kind that lives in tendons and doesn't require permission from the conscious mind. Captain Morrison. 5 tours. Her son's commanding officer. The man whose commendation letters had arrived at her apartment in brown envelopes she'd opened alone at 3 a.m. I need a crash cart. Now. Her voice had dropped an octave. Clipped. Military cadence. 2 clinic nurses stood frozen 6 feet away, one holding a boarding pass like it mattered, the other staring with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. The TSA agent by the security checkpoint turned. Travelers with rolling luggage stopped mid-stride. The terminal held its breath. He's gone into cardiac tamponade, Ashley said to the frozen nurses, her tone the kind that doesn't ask, doesn't suggest, commands. Rib fragment shifted during flight from Germany. The sac around his heart is filling with blood. He's got maybe 4 minutes before arrest. Move. One nurse moved. The other one didn't, which meant Ashley wasn't waiting for the crash cart. She pulled a 20-gauge spinal needle from her own jacket pocket, the one she'd carried since walking away from the Navy, old habit, old training, and located the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her hands were steady as surgical instruments. The skin was cool, the fluorescent light harsh, and somewhere a child was crying because the world had stopped making sense. Someone clear this area. Everyone back. Now. The needle went in with the kind of pressure that comes from knowing exactly where the resistance ends. The hiss. That was the sound, the release of pressure, air escaping from the pericardial sac, 60 milliliters of blood that had been suffocating the man's heart, and with it came the sinus rhythm. O2 sat, she snapped at the nurse who'd finally moved. 68. Monitor his vitals. I need epi ready. The crash cart arrived, wheels squeaking against polished terminal floor, and 2 more nurses she'd never seen before appeared, hospital staff responding to the code call someone had finally made. They looked at Ashley kneeling beside Morrison, hand steady, eyes focused on the monitor readout with the intensity of someone reading scripture, and they hesitated. You see his color? Ashley didn't look up. You see those veins? Cardiac tamponade doesn't wait for committees. 72. One of them moved to take over. Ashley didn't yield. 79. Morrison's breathing shifted. Shallower. Better. The color at his lips was still wrong, but it was changing, the gray giving way to something less terminal. A woman in the crowd had her phone up, video, probably, because this was the kind of moment that got uploaded before the ambulance even arrived. 85, Ashley said. He needs transfer to level 1. ICU bed ready. Cardiothoracic on standby. Someone was already dialing. The crash team had coalesced around her without realizing it. She was giving orders and they were taking them because something in her voice, her posture, the way she moved like water finding the lowest point, suggested she knew what she was doing. The hospital nurses exchanged looks. The TSA agent stepped aside, creating space. Travelers pressed against windows. A man in a suit was narrating into his phone, and there's this nurse, she pulled a needle from her jacket, she just knew exactly where to put it, she knew. 88. Good. Keep the O2 flowing. The stretcher was there, the kind that had seen too many airport medical crises. They loaded Morrison with a kind of coordination that only happens when everyone in the room has accepted that someone else is in command. Ashley didn't let go of the 4-line until the transfer was secure, and even then she moved with the stretcher, her hand on Morrison's shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. He's going to make it, she said, and her voice was the kind of certainty that comes from having watched men cling to life in worse circumstances. Stay with him. Tell him his 3rd platoon sends their regards. One of the hospital nurses froze. You know him. Ashley was already pulling her hand back, turning away, re-beckoning the person she'd been 30 seconds ago. The transformation happened like a light switch, the commanding presence folding back into itself, the voice climbing back up to register, the shoulders rounding slightly forward. By the time she stood, she was just a nurse again. Just someone who happened to know the right procedure, the right medication, the right prayer. But that nurse had seen something else. A flash of dog tags, maybe, visible for just a moment when Ashley had bent over Morrison. Or the scar on her wrist, the one shaped like shrapnel, the one she'd never explained to anyone. Or the way her hands had moved with the kind of precision that comes from hours in field hospitals, not just hours reading textbooks. I worked with his unit, Ashley said quietly. Long time ago. The nurse didn't push. But she would remember this moment. Later, when everything else fell apart, when the names started to surface and the medals came out of boxes, she would remember the way this quiet contractor had moved like someone for whom life and death were a familiar language. She would tell the investigator. The investigator would make a note. But right now, the stretcher was moving toward the ambulance bay, Morrison's blood pressure climbing, oxygen saturation hitting 92% and climbing still. Right now, the terminal was returning to normal, travelers gathering their phones, collecting their luggage, moving back through security like a river reforming around a stone. Right now, Ashley was walking back to the clinic, her jacket buttoned, her needle returned to her pocket, her face the mask of someone for whom the last 30 seconds had been just another day at work. The TSA agent watched her go. Did that civilian just? Yeah, the other agent said quietly. She did. By 4:51 p.m., Captain Dylan Morrison was in the ICU at Oregon Health and Science University. By 5:13 p.m., the cardiologists had confirmed the diagnosis Ashley had delivered on an airport terminal floor, cardiac tamponade secondary to a displaced rib fragment, likely from the pressure changes during the flight from Germany. By 6:22 p.m., Morrison was conscious, asking for his phone, asking for the name of the nurse who'd saved him because he wanted to thank her properly, because that was the kind of man he was. The hospital staff had no name. Just a description: blonde, mid-40s, moved like she'd been trained by someone who understood anatomy the way soldiers understand terrain. Spoke like she'd been giving orders her entire life. But Ashley was already gone, back in her apartment, her phone dark, her jacket hanging in the closet with a unit patch still sewn inside the lining, invisible to everyone but her. She didn't know yet that Morrison was awake. She didn't know yet that someone in that terminal had recorded the procedure. She didn't know yet that the video would find its way to a junior intern at the nursing board who would pull her file and read the termination notice filed by Greg Hargrove for hours before she'd knelt beside a dying man and reminded herself why she'd volunteered to walk away from her own life. What she did know, sitting alone in the dark, was that her hands had remembered. The needle had found the right space, the pressure had released, and for 30 seconds, she'd stopped being invisible. She'd been herself. The monitors showed what she already knew. Sinus rhythm. The green line climbed steady and sure, each pulse a second chance Morrison didn't deserve but would get anyway. Around her, the crowd of travelers and TSA officers stood frozen, watching a nurse in a crumpled badge pull a stranger back from the edge of nothing. 60 milliliters of blood. That was all it took. The pressure released, the oxygen climbed, and for one crystalline moment, Ashley Cooper existed exactly as she was meant to be. Then her radio crackled. Dr. Hargrove's voice came through the airport security channel, not the medical channel, the security channel, loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. This is Hargrove. I need the clinic supervisor and security to gate C7 immediately. We have an unauthorized medical procedure in progress. Repeat, unauthorized procedure. Ashley's hands were still steady. They didn't tremble as she checked Morrison's airway one more time, as she confirmed the oxygen saturation climbing through the 80s. The composure held. But she heard the shift in the crowd's energy, the hesitation in the TSA officer's stance, the way people's eyes moved from gratitude to doubt in the space of a single radio transmission. Security arrived in under 90 seconds. Two officers in Navy uniforms, hands near their belts, moving with the kind of authority that didn't ask questions. Behind them came Hargrove, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that didn't reach his eyes. He'd made his calls. The network was already moving. "Step back from the patient," one of the officers said. Ashley didn't step back. She documented the final O2 reading, 94% and stable, and only then did she move, peeling off her gloves with surgical precision. The motions were deliberate. Controlled. No panic, no protest, no breaking. Hargrove approached like a man who'd already won. His voice had that particular timbre of false sympathy, the sound of someone delivering bad news with genuine pleasure. "We're going to need to escort you from the terminal. There are protocols, Ms. Cooper. You performed a procedure you're not certified to perform on airport property. That's liability. That's my responsibility. Pericardiocentesis. 14-gauge needle. 60 milliliters of sanguineous fluid." Ashley's voice was level as a surgical laser. "Check the records. This patient had cardiac tamponade. The procedure was indicated. That's a decision for physicians to make, not clinic staff." Hargrove turned to the officers. "Her badge, please." One of them stepped forward, a woman with kind eyes and the kind of expression that said she didn't like this part of her job. Ashley unclipped the badge and held it out. The laminate was already yellowing at the edges. 3 months of existence, about to be 3 months of memory. "You're going to need to come with us," the officer said, but not unkindly. The walk to the clinic took 45 seconds. Ashley counted them the way she'd counted seconds in Ramadi, methodically, as a way of staying present when everything wanted to scatter. Her locker was in the back. She'd seen it this morning, had opened it to hang her jacket in the same spot where she'd hung it every morning for 91 days. Inside was the small accumulation of exile. A spare scrubs top folded with military precision. 3 protein bars. Her wallet containing $347 in cash. And sewn into the lining of her jacket, the faded unit patch from SEAL Team 7, the one she'd carried every single day since she left, the one she'd buried inside rather than wear it ever again. Hargrove watched her clear the locker with the expression of a man who'd successfully ended a threat. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, while she placed everything into a cardboard box marked "Clinic Supplies." The irony didn't escape her. "You should have stuck with stocking shelves," he said quietly, meant for her ears only. "You were good at following orders then." Ashley sealed the box and picked it up. She looked at him directly, one measured breath, one moment of eye contact that didn't waver. "You'll want to check the supply logs from the past 2 years." The epinephrine discrepancy was only the beginning. His face tightened. She'd meant for it to. 1 sentence. That was all she'd given him. That was all he deserved. The rain started that night. 3 days later, it was still falling, not the soft Pacific Northwest mist, but real rain, the kind that hammered the pavement in sheets and turned the city into something gray and impenetrable. Ashley sat on a plastic bench in the waiting room of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Portland, a cardboard box at her feet, and tried not to shake. The intake nurse was asking questions. Insurance. Previous providers. Reason for visit. Ashley couldn't seem to find words that made sense. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a high-pitched hum that made her teeth ache, that made her hands move in ways she couldn't control. She'd sat in this clinic before, years ago, when she'd still been someone. She'd treated the man in the wheelchair by the water fountain. She'd sutured the forehead laceration on the young Marine reading a 2-month-old sports magazine. She'd been their senior chief. They'd saluted her. Now she was in the waiting room, trying not to cry, trying not to explain that the fluorescent lights made her feel like she was underwater and drowning in increments. "Ms. Cooper?" The nurse was looking at her with genuine concern. "Can you tell me what brings you in today?" Ashley opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She'd performed a perfect pericardiocentesis. She'd brought a man back from cardiac arrest. She'd been herself for 30 seconds, and it had cost her everything. The nurse waited. There was kindness in the waiting, which somehow made it worse. I can't. Ashley started, then stopped. I need to schedule an appointment with psychiatry. I'm having difficulty. That was what she said. Difficulty. As if difficulty encompassed the 13 years of combat medicine, the faces she still saw at 3 a.m., the decision to walk away from the only identity she'd ever had so completely that she'd buried her own name in Portland like a body in a desert grave. Her apartment was half-packed when the knock came. She'd been methodically going through drawers, throwing away the small accumulation of normal life, the kitchen towels, the ceramic dishes, the Netflix password she'd never actually used. She decided to disappear more thoroughly this time. Maybe Seattle. Maybe somewhere no one would ever recognize her. The knock was urgent. Young. Ethan's knock. He burst through the door in the way only a 17-year-old Marine son could manage, moving like he'd learned it from watching her. His uniform was still sharp from dress blues, he'd come straight from somewhere official. And in his hands, shaking slightly, was a shadow box. Mom. His voice was breaking. Mom, they need to see these. The box contained medals. A ribbon bar that made no sense in this apartment, in this life, in this version of herself she'd tried to build. She knew them the way an amputee knew phantom limbs, present, undeniable, impossible. Ethan, what? Captain Morrison woke up. Mom, he asked for you. Specifically. He asked the nurses, where's the senior chief? Where's the nurse who saved me? And they didn't know what he was talking about, so he called me. He called me because he recognized something in how you moved, and he remembered that my last name was Cooper, and he asked if my mother was military. The rain was still falling outside. Sheets of it. Drowning everything. I told him yes, Ethan continued. I told him you were Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper. And he said that changed everything, and he was calling some people, and Mom, there's a hearing. Tomorrow. At the airport authority. About what happened with Dr. Hargrove. About what happened with you. Ashley sat down on the half-packed box of her life and looked at her son. 17 years old. Standing in her apartment with medals in a box, connecting dots she'd spent for years trying to erase. Ethan, I'm not just a nurse, he finished. That's what Captain Morrison said. He said, your mother is not just a nurse. And I looked at this. He lifted the shadow box. And I called the Navy. The next morning, before dawn, before the hearing, before everything broke open like a dam, Ashley stood at her apartment window and watched the rain fall. The unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining. She'd almost thrown it away 3 times in the past 72 hours. She'd held it in her hands at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat and fluorescent light-induced shaking, and she'd almost let it go. But Ethan had found it. Ethan had found her. And in the distance, beneath the sound of rain on windows, beneath the hum of the city waking up, she heard something else. A low thrumming sound. Getting closer. The rotor wash of a helicopter. The helicopter rotor wash shook the apartment windows as Ashley stood motionless in her living room, still wearing yesterday's scrubs. The sound grew louder, closer, the percussion of blades splitting the Portland sky. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. The trembling in her hands had nothing to do with fear anymore. The door burst open. Ethan stood in the frame, 17 years old, his face red, clutching a wooden shadow box against his chest. Inside, medals. Bronze stars catching the afternoon light. A Navy Commendation Medal. Ribbon she hadn't seen in 3 years. The box shook in his hands because he was shaking, his voice cracking like ice breaking under weight. Mom, they need to see these. Captain Morrison told me everything. Everything. Who you are. What you did. And he said, Ethan's voice broke completely. He said you saved his life at the airport because that's what you do. You save people. And they fired you anyway. Ashley reached out. She didn't speak. She took the shadow box from her son's trembling hands and held it against her chest, the wood cool against her scrubs. The rotor wash outside intensified. Not a request. It was a command. The noise stopped, but the presence remained, military transport, waiting on the tarmac. 48 hours later, the Emergency Airport Authority hearing convened in a conference room on the third floor of Portland International's administrative building. The windows overlooked the tarmac where that helicopter had landed. The board members sat in leather chairs, their expressions hovering between skeptical and bored. Dr. Hargrove sat on one side, perfectly composed, his attorney beside him. On the other side, Captain Morrison, still pale but standing, his dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. Behind him, a SEAL commander in dress blues whose chest carried more medals than most people had spoken sentences. Then Ethan stood. He was still holding the shadow box. His hands had stopped shaking, but his voice remained steady in that way young people sound when they understand they're saying something that matters. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Naval Special Warfare. He slid a classified service file across the table with precision. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. The sound of young respect crossing the room. She served 12 years. 3 tours. She saved the lives of 234 military personnel in Ramadi alone. And none of you knew that when you fired her. The board members exchanged glances. One opened the file. Captain Morrison stood then, movements deliberate, the kind of controlled motion that comes from command experience. He was still recovering. Ashley could see the pain in his breathing, but his voice carried weight. Senior Chief Cooper deployed to Ramadi in 2009 as senior medical officer attached to SEAL Team 7. Her record includes 3 Bronze Stars. He paused. Let that land. 2 with Vela device. Hargrove's attorney leaned toward him. Hargrove waved him off, his confidence still intact. This was his network. His board. His moment. Navy Commendation Medal, Morrison continued, reading from the file with the precision of someone who'd memorized the names of every person under his command. Deployment to Helmand Province. Combat Medical Certification in Forward Surgical Support. He looked directly at Hargrove. An thoracotomy performed under enemy fire in a collapsed structure. She kept a Marine alive for 6 hours until medevac arrived. That Marine is the father of 3 children now. The room's temperature seemed to shift. The board member's spine straightened. One of them, the director, ash gray suit, 17 years on the board, began reading the file faster, his eyes moving across classified details with increasing comprehension. The door opened. The SEAL commander stepped forward. His uniform was navy blue, he's bearing that particular quality of immovable force that comes from having stared down the worst humans have to offer and decided to stare harder. Behind him, 2 younger officers took positions at the room's back corners. Nobody had invited them. Nobody needed to. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Marie Cooper, Naval Special Warfare Group 3. The commander's voice sounded like a CV-130 engine idling in a hangar, steady, powerful, the kind of sound that makes your chest feel smaller. Bronze Star, 2009. Bronze Star with Vela, 2011. Silver Star, 2012. He paused after each name, giving the room time to understand the escalation. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. And a citation for extraordinary heroism under fire in a medical capacity that I am not at liberty to discuss in an open setting. He turned to face Hargrove directly. You attempted to discredit a decorated senior enlisted officer because she noticed 17 units of epinephrine missing from inventory. 17 units, Doctor. Over 6 weeks. Hargrove's face went the color of old paper. The attorney tugged his sleeve. Hargrove pulled away. The conference room door opened again. Different uniforms this time. Dark suits. FBI credentials flashing silver. One agent, a woman with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years listening to people lie, stepped to the table. Her badge read Special Agent Patricia Holloway. Dr. Gregory Hargrove. Not a greeting. A statement. We have been investigating your medical supply diversion for 8 weeks. 17 units of epinephrine per week. Channel to a pharmacy affiliate in Southeast Portland. $2,460 per unit. Street value approximately $37,000 per month. Hargrove's attorney was speaking now, hand up, words spilling. Hargrove wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the file open in front of the board director. However, Holloway continued, what moved this from a financial investigation to a federal case was your attempt to forge Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper's credentials. Your effort to have her professional certification revoked in order to cover the paper trail of your diversion scheme. Holloway set a document on the table. Attempted fraud against the state of Oregon. Obstruction of a federal investigation. Conspiracy to conceal financial crimes. And witness tampering. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. The attorney was saying something about due process. About consultation. Hargrove wasn't hearing it. He stood up. His chair scraped back with a sound like failure being recorded for history. This is insane, he said. His voice wasn't composed anymore. The network had failed. The board was reading classified file details. The SEAL team was standing in corners of his own hearing like sentries. She performed an illegal procedure. Unauthorized medical intervention. I documented. You documented nothing, Holloway interrupted, because there is nothing to document. Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper's pericardiocentesis on Captain Morrison was a life-saving procedure performed under Good Samaritan protections while acting as a private citizen responding to a medical emergency. The procedure is documented by security footage, by 17 witnesses, and by Captain Morrison's own medical records showing cardiac tamponade resolution. You, however, Holloway gestured, and 2 agents moved forward, documented your own criminal activity. Extensively. Hargrove tried to move toward the door. One of the SEAL officers stepped aside, not to let him pass, but to clear the path to the waiting agents. Hargrove stopped. His eyes searched the room for something, some small mercy, some remaining piece of his former authority. The TSA agents who witnessed his $50 bet in the terminal break room were waiting in the hallway. Ashley could see them through the glass partition. Their faces were perfectly still. Professional. Watching. The handcuffs clicked. Single, metallic sound. Hargrove's wrists together. His attorney was gathering papers, already calculating damage control, already moving on to the next client. The agents turned him toward the door. They didn't rush him. They didn't need to. His world had finished collapsing. As he passed through the hallway, those TSA agents didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched him being escorted past them with the kind of quiet clarity that comes from finally seeing someone accurately. His future was already written: community college classrooms, teenagers on their phones during CPR lectures, minimum wage direct deposit every other Thursday, a name tag that made him flinch every time someone called him by it. The board director stood up. He extended his hand to Captain Morrison, then to the SEAL commander. The gesture was clear. An apology in motion. A correction. Then he turned to Ashley. Senior Chief Cooper. Sacred Heart Hospital's trauma department has a vacancy. Chief position. Starting whenever you're ready. Full credentials restoration, back pay, and an apology that institutional policy failed you. Ashley didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since Ethan opened the file in that conference room. She stood, and her son, that 17-year-old who'd learned that some truths are too important to stay buried, stepped forward with the shadow box. With careful hands, the hands of someone who understood the weight of what he was doing, he removed the faded SEAL Team 7-unit patch from the bottom of the shadow box. The patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining before she left active duty. The patch she'd carried through 3 years of quiet exile, through deliberate invisibility, through 1,000 moments of choosing silence over recognition. He pinned it to her uniform, directly over her heart. She met his eyes. He was no longer breaking. He was standing in the presence of something he finally understood, not his mother's weakness, but her strength. Not her surrender, but her choice. The SEAL commander saluted. Formal. Precise. Fist to chest. The sound like a heartbeat made audible. Ashley returned the salute, and for the first time in 3 years, she stood in that position as herself. Not the quiet clinic nurse. Not the patient sitting in VA waiting rooms. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, veteran of Ramadi, decorated officer, mother, healer. That evening, she walked into the Sacred Heart Trauma Bay wearing the insignia. The nurses looked up. Several of them had worked with her before, had wondered where she'd gone, had seen the sudden gap in the schedule and assumed transfer. Some of them had read the news, the investigation, the fired administrator, the mysterious hero who'd saved an Army Ranger at the airport. When she stepped through those doors with the unit patch visible, something shifted in their faces. Comprehension. Respect. The quiet acknowledgement of a truth finally revealed. She didn't give speeches. She picked up a chart. 22-year-old male, blunt force trauma to the abdomen, ascending liver laceration, BP destabilizing. She was already moving, calling orders, her voice dropping into that register that carried absolute authority without a single word of apology. The younger nurses responded without hesitation. One of them whispered something to another, who nodded. They'd known something was wrong about her firing. They'd just never known what the truth was. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 3 years of holding herself at arm's length from the identity she'd earned, from the skills she'd developed, from the recognition that came with being good at something that mattered. That restraint was finally released. Not violently. Just completely. Her son visited the next morning, bringing flowers and terrible coffee from the hospital cafeteria. He set them on her desk in the chief's office, an office that still smelled like Hargrove's cologne, a detail the administration would fix by week's end. Ethan didn't say much. He didn't need to. You were right to walk away, Ashley said finally, looking at the unit patch framed on the wall, the official one now, the replacement. 3 years ago. You were right. I needed to disappear. I needed to not be a SEAL. For a while. What do you need now? Ethan asked. Ashley looked at the trauma bay through the window. At the organized chaos of people saving lives. At the young nurses she'd already mentally assessed, the one with steady hands, the one with perfect recall, the ones who'd be leading teams in 5 years if she trained them right. This, she said. I needed this. I need to be here. Not behind a uniform. Not performing for cameras. Just here. With my hands. With people who need it. A text came through on her phone. From Captain Morrison, still recuperating at home. A single line, thank you for being who you are when I needed you to be. She didn't respond. Some acknowledgements didn't need words. The hospital administration announced the trauma wing renovation the following week. New equipment. New protocols. A veteran-focused care section overseen by a senior chief who actually understood what those patients carried. The change rippled outward quietly, the way the most significant transformations usually do. But the real moment came 3 weeks later, at 6:27 a.m., when a young nurse rushed into the trauma bay with a patient and looked directly at Ashley, not with the doubt that had once characterized the clinic hierarchy, but with absolute certainty. Chief, I need you. The voice carried no question. Just professional clarity. Just respect earned through demonstrated competence, not demanded through rank. Ashley was already moving. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the opposite of fear. It was the feeling of finally standing in your own truth. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. But here's what I want to know, Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual story? Have you ever chosen to disappear from something you were good at because you needed to heal? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the people around us who are carrying more than we know. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room might just be the strongest.